Hi, this is Ali, and you're watching the third video in series How Internet is Secured. In this one, we'll talk about identification, authentication, and authorization. Most people use the terms identification, authentication, and authorization interchangeably. However, they are not to be mixed together, as each has its own distinct meaning and scope. This video shall discuss all these terms in details individually, followed by coverage of dynamic authentication and authorization workflows, and finally continuous authentication. Identification is the act of indicating a person or thing's identity. Here, someone is trying to tell the other party, person or system, who that entity is. You, for example, use different identities depending on context. You identify by name with friends, use email to identify on various websites, you use government issue IDs to open a bank account, passport on airport, etc. The idea of identification is not restricted to humans, it can be machines or IoT devices or even ancient artifacts, each having attributes used to identify them. For example, Mona Lisa is not a human, but an identity given to a drawing by its creator, and it has worked out pretty well until now. Authentication is the act of verifying identification. The identifying entity carries identification in the form of name, passport, key attributes, or just physical presence. And it is the role of authenticating entity to verify that identifying entity is actually who or what they claim to be. We are trying to restrict ourselves to technical authentication, but humans, machines, websites, and IoT devices still remain relevant to our discussion as current technology has to deal with all of them. In the context of security, failure to authenticate claimed identity can be a very costly mistake. If you read the Red Riding Hood story in school, you already know about false identification, authentication, and cost of poor authentication. The wolf pretended to be Red Riding Hood at her grandmother's house, and grandmother opened the door without any authentication and paid the ultimate cost. Modern day cyber attacks are done in eerily similar manner. As we saw in earlier videos, the entire internet security system is built on trust, but most scams are built on trust too. We'll share examples later, but let's currently stick to authentication and carry on. Given the situation, there are multiple ways of authenticating given information or provided identity. The idea is to collect evidence supporting the identity claim from credible sources. As an example, how would you authenticate someone say you are hiring? You would take interviews, do background checks via government provided IDs, and would consider his presence on LinkedIn or other social media platforms and checking how long the profile existed, and most importantly, check references. In such cases, apart from interview, you're trusting the credible platforms and individuals. Once all checks are done, you can certify that person's identity, skills, and personality traits in front of HR as a credible platform. Based on this example, authentication is accepting proof of identity given by a credible person or entity who has first-hand evidence that identity is genuine. For example, in case of web servers, we trust the certificate authorities, a credible platform that we trust, to have performed necessary checks during registration of entity. Another way of authentication is comparing attributes of identifying entity to prior knowledge about that entity. A good example is passwords, where we authenticate a user by matching his password to one already registered with us, or ask a security question that we have prior answer to. This is not a very reliable way of authentication and can at best be called implied but not guaranteed. There are three broad categories of authentication called factors of authentication. They are something the user knows, for example, passwords, PIN, security challenge question, pattern, date of birth, mother name, etc. Something the user has, keycard, government issue ID, cell phone, security token, physical or software, and something the user is. For example, fingerprint, face, voice, retinal pattern, DNA sequence, eye color, typing speed. Location and time can also be considered as additional factors. For example, if a login request comes to your office server from Asia, geolocated using IP address, after you walked out of the US office door using your keycard, let's say 2 hours ago, then it should be denied. and a red flag needs to be raised since it's physically and practically impossible. Let's talk about single factor authentication or SFA. In this authentication mode, one of the factors discussed earlier is used for authentication. This is considered the weakest level of authentication, and recommendation is to use at least two, if not more, authentication factors discussed in the previous slide. In contrast to single factor authentication, multi-factor authentication, MFA or 2FA, is the act of joining two or more authentication factors to authenticate the identity. You might be familiar with some, like authorization apps pop-ups on your phone when you sign in, or PIN-based credit or debit card, etc. MFA is not generally used all the time as it is cumbersome for users, and most websites weigh the balance between security requirement and practicality, where a user might move to a competitor if you start doing MFA at sign-in level every time. MFA is generally used when you are about to do some sensitive transaction, for example, transfer funds from your bank account or purchasing something of high value online. All depends on situational requirement. Mobile devices are widely used as part of 2FA or MFA these days as they are usually considered to be available with users all the time. OTP or one-time PIN is generally used to authenticate person doing the transaction in real time. At time of transaction online, a random number is sent to mobile device of user due to expire within a minute or two to kind of perform a 2FA of an already signed in person initiating the transaction. API-based authentication is widely used on internet today. Here user is issued a software token when he signs in, which he uses to perform actions on the website for the duration of browsing session. We'll discuss it in detail during authorization. Machine authentication is becoming more and more important these days as IoT devices take hold. Devices like your TV device or car navigation system need to access various services on internet on your behalf. You cannot allow any random device to make such requests since they would be logged against your name. So authentication mechanisms to allow you to register specific devices exist, where you say get an OTP on your mobile device to confirm registration as a way of authentication that this is indeed your device. Then the device can continue to make requests on your behalf without your involvement. Continuous authentication is a rapidly gaining technology in which a logged in user is continuously monitored to conform to available information about that user. We'll discuss it in detail later. Authorization is the act of verifying that you are permitted to do what you are trying to do. This is a way of restricting access to resources and/or actions to be performed by typically an authenticated user. It is akin to an access policy. For example, consider your app controls nuclear weapons of the country. While any citizen of country can be president, only the person with the role of president is authorized to perform the action in the app. Similarly, anyone may be able to create a pull request on a public GitHub repo, but only admins are authorized to merge it to production code. You specify the authorization in the policy definition phase of access control, where you define which people or roles qualify to access resources or perform certain actions. Then during enforcement phase, any access attempt is evaluated against defined criteria at runtime and access is granted or denied. In the examples in previous slide, we have heard the term role mentioned several times. Modern authorization schemes typically rely on role-based access control, or RBAC for short. The term was coined based on fact that not all users of a typical system are equal when it comes to accessing resources or performing tasks. Each job function has its own scope of access. Rather than giving equal access to everyone, most organizations rely on principle of least privilege or principle of least authority, called POLA, which basically mean any module in system, that is user, process, or program, must be able to access only the information that is strictly necessary for its legitimate purpose. This is really necessary to scale any business or system. As an example, if every app on your phone has complete access to your file system, contacts, emails, etc. by default, and you're responsible for limiting those on your own, You would either blind trust everything that you install or would spend all your time disabling access to individual apps. You can pretty much figure it doesn't work. Authentication and authorization workflows can be configured to be dynamic for many systems and evolve as necessary. As an example, most e-commerce websites allow anonymous browsing without need to log in, but require you to log in when you purchase an item, that is, authentication. Then during checkout, you may be required to go through multi-factor authentication if value of items being purchased increase a certain threshold, that is, authorization via policy. Authorization is critically important when it comes to API-based or machine-to-machine transactions. Most systems enforce a zero trust policy where every request needs to be accompanied with a valid access token, indicating authentication of user from some trustable token issuing authority. The tokens themselves have generally a limited access on target systems since systems tends to limit the reach of an authenticated user to intended workflows only. This is generally enforced via scopes, which we shall look into in our next video on open authorization or OAuth. Summarizing, it's generally a good idea to enforce a zero trust policy by default, authenticating using more than one authenticating factors by carefully planned workflows, keeping practicality in mind. And finally, limit the reach of even authenticated user at every step of the way, giving them no extra information, access, or reach than strictly necessary for their intended purpose. Continuous authentication is a new and exciting type of authentication leveraging AI, machine learning, data, IoT devices, and sensors. Mostly used in banking and other security sensitive scenarios, continuous authentication works by detecting anomalies in behavior or spending patterns to analyzing typing speed against typical patterns, accelerometer data from phone like how you normally pick up your phone, location and time of usage, etc. to continuously authenticate the user. In the next video in the series, we shall discuss authentication on web in further detail, from historic background to OpenID Connect or OIDC in detail. That's it for this video. If you like the content, please like and you can subscribe to be notified of exciting upcoming content. Thank you and goodbye.